Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write in the comments if you would ever enter a cave after hearing this story, because what happened to this group deep underground still sounds like a nightmare. They went into the cave as a team, laughing, talking, joking with each other in the dark, but hours later no one came back out. And when people finally reached the entrance, they found only bicycles, footprints in the mud, and a black tunnel breathing cold air from deep inside the mountain. Some said the boys were trapped by water. Others said something stranger happened in the darkness below, because the deeper people looked into that cave, the more disturbing the details became. This story begins in northern Thailand, near a cave system called Tam Luang, a place already known by locals as dangerous during the rainy season. It was the kind of place that looked harmless from the outside if you didn't know what it could become. A rocky entrance, wet earth, trees moving quietly in the wind. But inside, the cave stretched for kilometers under the mountain through twisting passages, steep chambers, hidden ledges, and tunnels that could flood without warning. In 2018, a group of 12 boys and their football coach entered that cave. They were young, full of energy after practice, and like many boys their age, they were not thinking about death, panic, or the mountain closing behind them. They were thinking about adventure, just a quick trip inside, just something exciting before going home. At first, everything felt normal. Their voices echoed through the entrance as they walked deeper in. Flashlights moved across the cave walls. Shoes scraped against wet stone. Some of them laughed when the tunnel opened into larger chambers where the darkness seemed endless beyond the beam of light. The air inside was colder than outside, thick with the smell of stone, mud, and underground water. Every sound repeated itself in strange ways. A cough came back like a whisper. A footstep returned like someone walking a second behind them. But they kept going, deeper, farther from daylight, farther from the world above. Somewhere behind them, rain had already started to fall. At first it was just a storm outside, nothing unusual, but caves like Tam Luang do not need much time to turn deadly. Water begins far away, collecting through the mountain, filling low passages, cutting off exits one by one, and the people inside do not always realize the danger until the path back is already gone. When the boys finally turned around, the tunnel they had come through was no longer the same. Water had begun creeping over the floor, shallow at first, then darker, faster. The mud sucked at their shoes. The younger boys started asking questions. The coach told them to stay calm and move higher into the cave until the water dropped. It was the only choice left, so they moved deeper instead of out, and that decision pushed them further into the mountain than they had ever planned to go. The deeper they walked, the stranger the cave began to feel. The walls narrowed, then opened into chambers where the flashlight beams could not fully reach the ceiling. Water dripped in slow, uneven rhythms. Thin streams ran down the rock like veins. At one point, one of the boys stopped and pointed at the wall. There, across the wet stone, were long, dark streaks that looked almost like something had been dragged over the surface. Not neat marks, not scratches from tools, something messier, uneven, smudged, almost like muddy hands sliding along the wall in panic. Another boy laughed nervously and said it was probably nothing, just old mineral stains, just mud left behind by other people, but no one touched the wall. They simply stared for a few seconds and kept walking. The laughter after that was quieter. The coach told them to stay close together. No one moved alone. Their lights kept searching the tunnels ahead while the sound of water behind them grew louder. In a place like that, darkness does something to the mind. It makes every shadow look alive. It stretches distance. It changes sound. The boys began hearing things they could not explain. A sound like a rock falling somewhere deeper in the cave. Then what sounded like footsteps, even when everyone in the group had stopped moving. Then a low echo that seemed too long to be their own voices. One boy whispered that he felt like something was watching them from beyond the edge of the light. No one answered him, because by then some of the others felt it too. They kept going until they found higher ground, a ledge above the rising water where they could gather and rest. It was cramped and cold, but dry enough to sit. The boys pressed close together, breathing hard, trying to act brave for one another. Their flashlight beams moved over the chamber walls, over jagged rock, over cracks that disappeared into deeper darkness, and then one of them froze. He aimed his light toward a narrow opening across the chamber. For 1 second, maybe less, 2 small red reflections stared back from the blackness. They did not move like a person with a flashlight. They did not blink like a normal animal caught in the light. They were just there, low to the ground, silent, watching. Another boy swung his flashlight in the same direction, but the red points were gone. Some said it was just water reflecting the beam. Some said it had to be an animal trapped in the cave, but no one crossed that chamber to check. After that, even the coach stopped pretending everything felt normal. Time passed differently underground. No phones, no sunlight, no sense of day or night. Just darkness, damp stone, and the steady awareness that the world above was very far away. Hunger began to grow. Cold settled into their clothes. The boys tried to stay close and conserve energy, but fear moved through the group in waves. One moment they were quiet. The next, someone would swear they heard breathing in a tunnel nearby. Another would say he heard a scraping sound from the wall behind them. A younger boy started crying when he thought he saw a shadow move where no one was standing. The coach tried to calm them, telling them to focus on what was real, stay together, save light, wait for help. But deep inside that mountain, reality itself began to feel unstable, because every few minutes the cave reminded them they were not alone with silence. Water moved where they could not see it. Stones clicked in the dark. Strange echoes came and went without warning, and sometimes, when the flashlights trembled across the walls, those long black streaks looked less like stains, and more like signs left by someone else who had once tried to find the way out. The longer they stayed on that ledge, the more the cave began to feel less like a place and more like something alive. The darkness around them no longer seemed empty. It felt watchful, heavy, as if the mountain were listening to every whisper, every breath, every nervous movement of their hands as they tightened their grip on the weak beams of their flashlights. The boys sat shoulder to shoulder, trying to stay warm, trying to stay calm, but fear had already settled into the group like a second cold. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. The way back was gone. The water below them was still rising, and every hour inside that cave made the outside world feel farther away, almost unreal, like sunlight and open air belonged to another life. The coach kept his voice low and steady. He told them to breathe slowly, to save their energy, to not waste the flashlight batteries. He reminded them that people would search for them, that someone would notice they were missing, that they just had to wait. But waiting in darkness is harder than walking. Walking gives the mind something to do. Waiting leaves room for fear to grow, and fear grows fast underground. One of the younger boys kept staring toward the narrow opening where the red reflections had appeared. He said nothing for a long time, but his hands were shaking. Finally he whispered that he had seen them again. Not clearly, not fully. Just 2 red points low in the tunnel, then gone when he blinked. Another boy snapped at him and said to stop it, that he was scaring everyone. But the truth was, everyone was already scared. No one had forgotten those red reflections. No one had forgotten the strange marks on the wall, and no one could explain the sounds that sometimes drifted through the cave from places their lights could not reach. At some point, the coach stood up and carefully moved a few steps along the ledge to check the chamber. The beam from his flashlight slid over wet stone, jagged edges, and shallow trickles of water falling from above. Then the light paused on the wall opposite them. There were more marks there, not one or two, many, long smears crossing over each other in strange directions, some thin, some thick, some ending abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. They were dark against the pale rock, too irregular to feel natural, too scattered to form any clear pattern. One of the boys asked if they were old rope marks. Another said maybe rescue teams had been there before. The coach didn't answer right away. He just stared at the wall for several seconds, then lowered the flashlight and told them again to stay close. That silence told them more than words could. He did not know what the marks were either. The cave around them answered with another sound. This time it came from deeper in the system, a hollow noise that rolled through the stone like something dragging itself across rock. It was not loud. That was what made it worse. Loud sounds can be explained away. A crash, a fall, water. But this was softer, slower, and strange enough that every boy on that ledge went still at once. One flashlight turned toward the tunnel, then another. Then all of them were aiming into the same black passage, their beams overlapping and shaking. Nothing was there, just darkness, wet stone, the faint shimmer of moving water. Yet a few seconds later the sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape, then silence. One of the boys whispered that it sounded like someone crawling. Another said it was just rocks shifting because of the water. The coach told them both to be quiet, not because he was angry, because he was listening too. They all were. And beneath the distant movement of water in the cave, beneath the drip of condensation from the ceiling, something else was there, something irregular, something that did not belong to the rhythm of the flood. Hours passed in broken fragments. They tried to rest, but no one slept deeply. Every time someone closed his eyes for too long, a sound or movement pulled him back awake. A stone dropping somewhere beyond the chamber, a faint splash from the darkness below. Once, one of the boys jerked upright and said someone had touched his arm. The others swore no one had moved. Another insisted he heard breathing close to the ledge, too low and too slow to belong to anyone in the group. When they turned all the lights outward, they saw nothing but the black shape of the cave pressing back against them. It was impossible to know what was real and what fear was creating. That is one of the worst things about deep caves. The dark does not just hide things. It starts building them inside your head. But sometimes fear begins with something real. Sometime later, when hunger and exhaustion had made them all quiet again, one of the flashlights flickered across the wall near the narrow tunnel and stopped. Fresh marks. That was the first thought that hit them all at once. The wet streaks on the stone looked darker than before, shinier somehow, as if something had touched the wall recently. They were not there when the beam passed that same spot earlier. At least no one remembered seeing them. The marks were low this time, closer together, and trailed toward the opening where those red reflections had appeared. No one spoke. The silence among the group became absolute. Even the younger boys who had been whispering before now stared without moving. The coach stepped forward again, carefully, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the tunnel. The opening was narrow and partly hidden by uneven rock. Beyond it, the darkness looked thicker than the rest of the cave, like the light itself was being swallowed before it could enter. He took one more step, then he stopped. From somewhere inside that tight black space came a sound that did not belong in any cave. A low exhale, not loud, not animal enough to understand, not human enough to name, just breath, slow, controlled, close. One of the boys made a choking sound in his throat. Another grabbed the arm of the person beside him so hard his knuckles turned pale. The coach backed away without taking his eyes off the tunnel. No one asked what he had heard, because they all knew. The cave had just answered them. And after that, even the ones who had tried hardest to stay rational stopped pretending this was only water and shadows, because somewhere in the tunnels beyond their ledge, something was moving through the darkness with them. No one moved for several seconds after that sound came from the tunnel. The boys remained frozen on the ledge, every flashlight locked on the same black opening, every face pale and tight with fear. Even the coach, who had tried to hold the group together through rising water and darkness, looked different now, more alert, less certain. He slowly raised one hand, signaling the boys not to make noise. In a place like that, silence becomes its own kind of survival. If something was really in the cave with them, then shouting would not help, panic would not help. All they had left was stillness, weak light, and the desperate hope that morning above ground was bringing searchers closer to the entrance. But down there, deep under the mountain, time felt dead. There was no sunrise, no sunset, just cold stone, black water, and the pressure of darkness pressing in from every direction. One of the boys began whispering prayers under his breath. Another covered his mouth with both hands to stop his teeth from chattering. The group had started the day as teammates on a small adventure. Now they looked like survivors from some underground nightmare, huddled together on a narrow strip of dry rock, while the cave slowly changed around them. The water below the ledge had risen enough that it now reflected their flashlights in trembling strips of silver. Every few minutes the surface rippled, though no one could see what disturbed it. It might have been the flood pushing through hidden cracks in the cave. It might have been debris drifting in from deeper tunnels, or it might have been something else entirely. In that darkness, nothing had a clear shape anymore. Even ordinary movement felt wrong. One of the older boys tried to stay practical. He asked the coach in a low voice how long they could wait there. The coach answered quietly, telling them rescue would come, that people would search once the parents realized they had not come home. He spoke with certainty, but his eyes kept returning to the same narrow opening, the one where the red reflections had appeared, the one where that slow breath had come from. He was trying to hold the group together, but the cave was pulling at all of them, breaking their confidence piece by piece. Somewhere far above, rainwater continued feeding into the tunnels. The mountains swallowed it without mercy. What had once been pathways were now underwater channels. What had once been harmless dips in the cave floor were now barriers of black water, impossible to cross without light, air, or knowing how deep they really were. The boys understood this much even without being told. They were not simply waiting. They were trapped, and the cave knew it. Minutes dragged on. Then one of the flashlights dimmed. It did not go out fully, but it weakened enough for everyone to notice. The beam lost strength and turned dull, forcing the boy holding it to shake it in panic. The coach moved immediately, telling everyone to use lights only when necessary. Save power. Keep them low. Do not waste batteries searching the dark every time fear tightens in your chest. It was good advice, but terrifying to hear, because conserving light meant accepting more darkness, and none of them wanted more darkness, not after the sounds, not after the marks, not after those impossible red eyes staring from beyond the edge of the beam. They lowered the lights, and the chamber changed at once. Shapes blurred into shadow. The walls seemed farther away. The ledge felt smaller. The darkness below them looked deeper. They could no longer see the details of the opposite rock face, only the vague outline of the chamber and the black throat of the tunnel across from them. And once the cave regained some of its darkness, the sounds returned. First the dripping, then distant water, then something else. A faint tapping, slow and uneven, like small stones being moved one at a time. Tap, silence, tap, tap, long silence. Then again. One of the boys whispered that maybe rescue teams were inside the cave already. Maybe someone was climbing toward them through the tunnels. Hope flashed across a few faces for just a second, but the tapping did not grow closer the way footsteps should. It moved sideways somehow, strange in its direction, echoing from one wall and then another in a pattern no one could map. Soon, hope turned back into dread. Because the sound was not coming from the flooded way behind them, where rescuers would have to enter. It was coming from deeper inside the mountain, from the places no one had gone. One of the youngest boys finally started crying openly. He tried to muffle it, ashamed, but fear had become too heavy. The coach pulled him closer and told him to breathe, told all of them to breathe, to focus on each other, not the cave. Stay together. That was the only rule that mattered now. Stay together. He repeated it again and again until the words became almost like a ritual against the dark. But even as he spoke, one of the boys pointed toward the wall at the far side of the chamber. At first, nobody understood what he meant. Then they saw it. One of the long black streaks on the wall had changed. It looked fresher somehow, longer than before, as though something wet had slid a little farther down the rock. The group stared in silence. No one wanted to cross the chamber to check it. No one wanted to say what they were thinking, because if the marks were changing, then something in the cave was still making them. A few seconds later came the scream. It was short, sharp, and close enough that every boy on the ledge nearly jumped, but it had not come from anyone in the group. It came from one of the tunnels branching off beyond the chamber, a distorted cry that echoed through the cave in a way that made it impossible to tell whether it was human, animal, or just the mountain twisting a sound into something monstrous. The scream bounced through the stone, broke apart, returned weaker, then died. After that, no one even pretended to stay brave. The younger boys clung to each other. One of the older ones whispered that they needed to move. Another argued that moving deeper would kill them faster. The coach forced them to stay put, but his own breathing had changed. It was quicker now, more strained. Fear was no longer something he was managing. It was inside him too. Then came the eyes again. This time there was no doubt. 2 red points appeared in the darkness near the narrow opening, perfectly still, low and level, watching from beyond the rock. The lights hit them directly, and for a full second they remained there, glowing against the black. Several boys gasped at once. One almost dropped his flashlight. Another shouted something in panic. The red points did not blink. They did not move. They simply held their place, as if whatever owned them had no fear of the light at all. Then, with a slight shift of shadow, they vanished. Not by turning away, not by running, just gone, as if the cave had closed over them. That was the moment the group understood something they could not explain. Whatever was in that cave was not passing through. It was staying near them, watching them, waiting with the same patience as the floodwater rising inch by inch below the ledge. The coach finally made a decision. He told them that if the water rose any higher, they would have to move to another shelf farther along the chamber wall. It would be dangerous. Wet rock, narrow footing, almost no space for mistakes. But staying where they were might soon become impossible. No one argued. They were too tired, too hungry, too shaken. They simply nodded and gathered closer, preparing to move through a cave that no longer felt empty. And as they shifted their weight and readied their weak flashlights, another sound drifted from deep beyond the tunnel. Not a scrape, not a tap, not breath. This time it was almost like a voice, stretched and distorted by the stone, low enough that no words could be understood, but close enough to make every hair on their bodies rise. Something in the dark had heard them moving. The boys began moving along the chamber wall one by one, slowly, carefully, pressing their backs against cold stone while their shoes searched for footing on the narrow, wet ledge. The coach went first, holding his flashlight low so the others could see where to place their feet. The drop beside them was not a cliff, not exactly, but the black water below looked deep enough to swallow a person without leaving a sound behind. Every step sent loose gravel sliding into the darkness. Every small splash made the boys flinch and turn their lights toward the water, half expecting to see something just beneath the surface. The chamber felt different now that they were moving, larger in some places, tighter in others. The walls seemed to shift shape depending on where the beams landed. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the rock, turning simple cracks into mouths, narrow fissures into eyes, and wet mineral stains into shapes that looked too deliberate to be natural. One of the boys nearly slipped on the slick stone and caught himself with a hand against the wall. When he pulled it back, he gasped. His palm was covered in something dark and wet, thicker than mud, smeared across his skin like it had been fresh on the rock. He wiped it desperately on his shorts, breathing hard, refusing to look too closely at what it was. The others pretended not to notice, but they all did. They kept moving. There was no choice now except forward. The new shelf was only a few meters away, but in that cave it felt like crossing another world. When they finally reached it, they found a slightly wider area where the wall curved inward, forming a shallow pocket above the waterline. It was darker there, more enclosed, and the ceiling hung lower overhead. The air felt colder too, as if that part of the chamber had not felt warmth in years. The coach motioned for the boys to crouch close together and keep the lights low. He listened for several seconds, head tilted toward the tunnels behind them, but the cave had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Not the empty quiet of safety, but the held-breath silence that comes just before something happens. One of the older boys whispered that maybe they should call out, just once, in case rescuers were nearby. The coach hesitated, then shook his head. The idea of making noise in that place now felt wrong, almost dangerous. Their voices might bounce through the cave and come back twisted, or worse, answer something that had been waiting in the dark to hear them again. So they stayed silent. Minutes passed, maybe more. It was impossible to know. One flashlight flickered weakly, then steadied. Another was already dim enough that the beam barely reached the opposite wall. In the weak light, the rock surfaces around them began revealing details the brighter beams had hidden before. Fine scratches etched across the stone, small chips in the wall as if something hard had struck there repeatedly, thin dark lines in corners where moisture gathered and ran downward. And there, just above head level, more of those same long smeared marks, some crossing over each other, some ending in tapered streaks, as though fingers or something like fingers had dragged through wet sediment and then vanished into shadow. One of the boys leaned closer and whispered that the marks looked newer here. Another snapped at him to stop looking. The coach said nothing, but he was looking too. He reached his light upward for a better view, and in that instant something moved across the ceiling just beyond the beam. Fast, silent, too fast to identify. The flashlight jerked after it, but found only jagged rock, beads of water, and darkness tucked into natural gaps in the stone. The boys saw the coach's face change, only slightly, but enough. He had seen it too. That was all they needed to know. A low vibration passed through the cave floor beneath them, so faint it could almost have been imagined. The water below the shelf rippled in widening circles. Then came the sound again, from deeper in the system. Not a scream this time, not scraping, not breath. It was closer to a murmur, like several voices speaking somewhere far away, with the words ground down by stone, until only tone remained. The boys pressed tighter together. One covered his ears. Another kept swinging his flashlight toward the black opening at the edge of the chamber, as if he could force the dark to reveal whatever lived inside it. But the cave gave them nothing clear, only suggestion, only hints, only the terrible certainty that they were not alone. At one point a boy near the back whispered that he saw someone standing across the water. Everyone turned their lights at once. For a brief second, the overlapping beams created the illusion of a tall shape near the far wall, narrow and still, almost human in outline. Then the light shifted and it became just rock again, a column of wet stone surrounded by shadow. A few boys nervously laughed, the kind of laugh that comes too quickly and dies too fast. But nobody fully relaxed, because even if that shape had been nothing, All of them had believed it for a second, and belief is powerful underground. The coach finally told them to rest in turns, not sleep. Just close their eyes, breathe, and let someone else hold the light for a few minutes. He needed them to save strength, needed their minds from breaking apart before help could reach them. Some obeyed. Others could not close their eyes anymore. Every time they did, they saw those red points in the tunnel, hanging low in the dark, steady and silent. One younger boy, barely able to keep his voice under control, asked the coach if he thought there were animals in the cave. The coach answered carefully, maybe bats, maybe something washed in by water, maybe reflections. His words were reasonable, but his tone was not convincing. He was speaking like a man trying to build a bridge across panic with whatever material he still had left. Then something happened that ended whatever calm remained. One of the flashlights, resting on the rock beside them, rolled slowly by itself toward the edge of the shelf. Nobody touched it. The stone under it was uneven, but not sloped enough for that movement. The light rolled, stopped, then turned just enough for its weak beam to point straight into a narrow crack in the wall beside them. And inside that crack, very close now, two red reflections glowed back from the darkness, not across the chamber, not in the tunnel, here, beside them, so close that the boys nearest the wall cried out and scrambled away, nearly falling into the others. The coach grabbed the flashlight and aimed it directly into the crack, but whatever had been there withdrew at once. The red points slid backward without sound and vanished deeper into the stone. Everyone was talking at once now, whispering too loudly, tripping over each other's words. The coach shouted for silence, and the boys forced themselves to stop. They all stared at the crack. Nothing came out, nothing moved, but the feeling changed completely after that. Before, the thing in the cave had seemed distant, watching from tunnels, lingering near the edge of the light. Now it had come close enough to study them from inside the wall itself, and if it could move through spaces that narrow, then none of them understood the shape of what they were dealing with. The water below them rose another few centimeters. It lapped at the lower edge of the stone shelf, black and cold, carrying bits of leaves and mud from somewhere unseen. The boys could smell the damp mineral scent of the flood more strongly now. Their little pocket of safety was shrinking again. The coach knew it. They all knew it. Soon they would have to move once more, farther along the chamber, maybe toward a side passage that climbed higher into the cave, deeper into the mountain, deeper into whatever had already begun circling them. He looked at the boys one by one, making sure they were still with him, still able to stand, still able to follow instructions. Then he turned his flashlight toward a narrow rise of rock leading away from the shelf. It was steep, wet, and partially hidden by a shadow, but it might lead upward. He told them they would move as soon as the water touched the place where they were crouching. Nobody argued. Nobody even asked questions anymore. The cave had stripped them down to something simpler than fear, obedience, survival, motion. They waited in silence, watching the water creep higher, listening to the low murmur of the mountain. And then, from somewhere above them this time, not from the tunnel, not from the water, but from the dark ceiling just beyond the light, came a single small sound, a click, like claws touching stone. Every head snapped upward at the same time. The flashlights trembled in the boys' hands as they searched the ceiling, dragging weak beams across wet rock, hanging mineral teeth, and narrow cracks lost in shadow. For one terrible second, they saw nothing. Then one of the lights caught movement, not clearly, just enough to freeze the blood in everyone's body. Something had crossed the ceiling above them and slipped into a dark fold of stone before the beam could lock onto it. It was too quick to understand, too smooth to feel like falling debris, too deliberate to be water. The chamber exploded into panic. One of the younger boys cried out and grabbed the shoulder of the person beside him so hard they nearly lost balance on the wet shelf. Another dropped his flashlight, and it clattered against the rock before stopping near the edge, its beam spinning crazily over the chamber walls and making every shadow look alive. The coach lunged for it before it fell into the water, then turned and forced his voice low and hard. "Stay together, stay low, don't run, don't split up." In a place like that, one wrong movement could kill them faster than anything hiding in the dark. But even with his words cutting through the panic, fear was already moving through the group like poison, because the sound from the ceiling had confirmed something none of them wanted to accept. Whatever was in the cave could move above them too. The coach aimed his flashlight slowly upward again, this time tracing every crack in the rock with painful care. Water dripped from the ceiling onto his face and shoulders. The beam slid across mineral formations, slick black stone, and shallow ledges where nothing should have been able to stand. But deep caves are full of impossible spaces, gaps too narrow for a person, shelves too small to trust, holes that seem to end but actually continue farther back into the mountain. It could be hiding in any of them, or it could already have moved again. The boys pressed tighter into the curve of the wall, trying to make themselves smaller. The water below them touched the edge of the shelf now, thin black fingers slipping over the rock and withdrawing again with each movement of the current. Their safe place was almost gone. Soon they would have to climb the rise the coach had found, deeper into the cave, farther from the entrance, farther from anything that felt human. One of the older boys whispered that they should go now, before the thing above them got closer. The coach hesitated only a second, then nodded. Waiting had become its own danger. He told them the order. He would go first, then the two youngest, then the rest, with the strongest boys helping from behind. No one moves alone. No one looks away from the person in front of them. If someone slips, everyone stops. Those simple instructions gave the group something to hold on to, a rule, a shape, a way through panic. The coach climbed first, testing each step on the narrow rise of wet rock. The path angled upward along the wall, twisting through a break in the chamber where the ceiling dipped lower. The stone was slick and uneven, forcing him to use one hand against the wall for balance while holding the flashlight in the other. He turned and signaled for the next boy to follow. One by one they began moving. Shoes scraped against rock. Breath echoed too loudly. Every few seconds someone looked up at the ceiling, expecting to see red eyes looking down from above, but the darkness remained blank. That almost made it worse. If they had seen it clearly, maybe fear would have found a shape. Instead, they were climbing through uncertainty itself. Halfway up the rise, the boy in the middle of the line stopped so suddenly the one behind him nearly ran into him. He pointed his shaking flashlight at the wall. There, only inches from his face, was another mark. Not a smear this time, a pattern, 4 narrow lines cut into the wet stone, parallel, shallow but too sharp to be natural. Below them, a darker drag mark trailed downward and disappeared behind a jut of rock. The boy whispered that it looked like claws. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The coach told them to keep moving, but his voice had gone thinner now, stretched by the same fear gripping the rest of them. They rounded the jut of rock and entered a narrow upper passage where the air changed immediately. It was tighter there, more stale, and colder in a way that did not feel natural. Their lights caught only a few meters ahead before the tunnel bent out of sight. Behind them, the chamber remained half visible through the opening, black water slowly swallowing the shelf they had just left. That image stayed in their minds. If they had waited even a little longer, they might have been trapped there with nowhere to stand. So they crouched inside the passage, breathing hard, trying to decide whether this new place was safer or just another trap. Then they heard it again, the clicking sound. This time closer, not above, ahead. Click, pause, click, click, slow and careful, like something testing the stone one point at a time. The tunnel bent to the left, hiding whatever made the sound. The boys froze in a line. The coach raised his light toward the bend and took one slow step forward, then another. The beam shook slightly, not enough to lose the tunnel, but enough for everyone behind him to see that even he was near the edge now. The clicking stopped. The silence after it felt so complete that the boys could hear each other swallow. Water dripped behind them from the chamber below. A flashlight flickered. Someone whispered, "No." The coach kept going until he reached the bend and turned the beam around the corner. At first, the light showed only more rock, tighter walls, and a narrow strip of mud running along the passage floor. Then the beam lowered slightly and stopped. The mud ahead was marked, freshly disturbed. Small tracks, but wrong somehow. Not shaped like shoes. Not like any animal track the boys knew. They were narrow, repeated, almost hand-like in places, as if something with too many thin points had moved through the mud and then vanished onto dry stone. The coach stared at them too long. Then he backed up a step without turning around. That alone sent a fresh surge of terror through the line of boys. He never backed away from simple mud. He backed away because he had seen enough. One of the older boys whispered, "What is it?" But the coach only told them all to stay quiet. His light remained fixed on the passage ahead. Then, from farther around the bend, deeper in the tunnel, came the low murmur again. Closer now. Not words, never clear words, but layered somehow, as if more than one voice were speaking through stone and water at once. The sound crept into the passage and seemed to vibrate in the boys' chests. One of the younger ones began crying silently, tears running down his face while he held both hands over his mouth. The coach looked back and made a decision. They would not go deeper into that passage. Not yet. He motioned for everyone to turn carefully and retreat a few steps to a slightly wider spot near the opening, where they could still watch both the chamber behind and the tunnel ahead. A terrible position, but better than walking blind into whatever had left those tracks. As they shifted backward, the last boy in the line glanced toward the chamber opening below. Then he let out a thin, broken whisper. Everyone turned. Across the black water, on the far wall of the chamber they had just left, one of the long streaks was moving, not falling, not dripping, moving sideways, slowly, as if something wet and dark were dragging itself along the rock just beyond the reach of their lights. The beam hit it directly, and for a moment they all saw it clearly enough to understand the horror, but not clearly enough to name it. Then the mark slid behind a curtain of stone and was gone. The boys recoiled deeper into the passage. Their breathing became ragged. The cave was no longer surrounding them from one direction. It was active above, below, ahead, and behind. The mountain was full of movement now. The coach forced them into a crouched cluster near the bend, trying to keep the weakest in the middle, trying to cover both directions with the fading lights. He spoke quietly, urgently, telling them help would come, telling them they only had to hold on. But even as he said it, another sound rose through the cave system, a distant metallic clank, faint but real, from far back toward the flooded entrance. The boys looked at one another in disbelief. Metal, not stone, not claws, not water, metal. For the first time in what felt like forever, something human had entered the cave, and somewhere between the trapped boys and the approaching rescuers, something in the dark had already begun to move. The metallic sound came again, faint but unmistakable, somewhere beyond the flooded tunnels behind them. A clink, then another. The boys stared at one another, barely daring to breathe. For a second, hope cut through the fear like a blade. Rescue equipment, carabiners, metal against stone, human sound, real sound, not the whispers of the cave, not the clicking from the dark, not the breathing hidden beyond the tunnel. The coach felt it too. He leaned toward the chamber opening and shouted for the first time since the nightmare began. The sound of his voice exploded through the cave, echoing off stone, breaking into fragments, rushing into black water and tight passages below. The boys joined in, yelling with everything left in their bodies. Their voices bounced back at them, twisted and broken. But beneath the echoes, somewhere far away, something answered. Not words, not clear, but enough. Enough to know someone was coming. The moment Hope entered the cave, everything changed, because from the darkness ahead came the clicking again, faster now. From the chamber below came a violent splash against the rock. One of the boys screamed and swung his flashlight toward the opening. Across the black water, high on the opposite wall, those red eyes appeared one final time. Not far now, not hidden, watching with a stillness that felt older than fear itself. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then the eyes blinked out. At the same moment, the wall near the narrow crack beside them shook with a sharp scrape, as if something had turned violently inside the stone. The coach shouted for the boys to stay close and keep calling. Behind them the metal sounds grew louder, human voices, distorted by the cave, but human. Real rescuers were entering the flooded system, pushing closer through mud, water, and darkness. The boys cried out again and again, some sobbing as they shouted. Light flickered through the chamber behind them, weak at first, then brighter, moving across the flooded rock in brief flashes. Another splash came from somewhere below, but none of the boys looked at the water anymore. They looked only at that distant moving light. The beam of a rescuer's lamp finally cut through the darkness across the chamber wall, and in that instant every strange shadow seemed to collapse back into ordinary stone. The long marks on the wall looked like mud and mineral streaks again. The whispered murmur vanished into the normal roar of water in a cave system under pressure. The clicking overhead stopped, and whatever had moved through the darkness with them withdrew into places no human eye could reach. When the rescuers finally reached the boys, the group broke apart in sobs, shaking, clinging to each other and to the adults pulling them toward safety. Later, many would say that hunger, exhaustion, darkness, and fear can turn a cave into something else in the mind, that shadows become figures, water becomes voices, reflections become eyes. Maybe that was true. Maybe everything they saw had a simple explanation buried somewhere in stone, mud, and panic. But years later, some of the boys still refused to speak in detail about what happened in those hours deep inside the mountain. They would describe the flood, the cold, the hunger, the waiting. But when questions came about the marks on the wall, the sounds in the dark, or the red reflections low in the tunnel, their answers usually stopped, and the rescuers, though they found the group alive, also reported something strange that day. In several of the upper chambers, fresh streaks had appeared on the walls in places the boys should never have been able to reach. No one could explain them, so the official story remained simple. A group entered a cave. Rain trapped them underground. Rescuers brought them out alive. That was the truth the world remembered. But deep beneath the mountain, in the black flooded chambers, where light dies quickly and sound loses its shape, another version of the story still lingers. A version whispered only in fragments. That when the boys were trapped in the dark, they were not alone, and that whatever watched them from beyond the edge of the flashlight beams disappeared only when the first human lights finally broke through the cave.